because it is a war on the earth. It's an all-out assault on life. Every living being is in peril. We're here not as wage organizers, but as organizers and activists. We're not scholars, we're not academics, though we really appreciate those workers. We're folks who care deeply about the South, where we live and work. And that's why we're here, to bring you this program.
Thanks for letting us do this. For the purpose of this presentation, we've limited most of our report to the Southeast. A special place we like to refer to as Atomic Appalachia as well, which, like the Coleman story of Middle Earth, is squeezed somewhere in between the Central Appalachians and the Southern Appalachians. We'll plan to just plow through this. There's just so much, information about the militarization and the impacts of it in the South that it's just going to take us through. We'll do what we can to leave some time for Q&A at the end. So this represents the military-industrial complex. It's actually a puppet from the School of the Americas, protest. I don't know if you can quite see it, but its hands are pushing a body, a person, into its mouth, and it's, the combination of the military, the global corporate, and the U.S. government. The MIC colludes in profiteering from the war. They work together to drive U.S. foreign economic policy, to fund and promote war with taxpayers' money, and nearly every industry today is connected to the military-industrial complex.
Essentially, war profiteers sell wars to politicians who sell it to the public using the cynical rhetoric of freedom and security. One definition of fascism is the conjoining of state interest with corporate interest. Just follow the money and decide for yourself who is or what is making the decisions that affect the survival of life on this planet.
And with each day, more and more species are lost to extinction, forests and mountains are reduced to moonscapes, polar ice caps are melting away into the sea. Capitalism's destructive and polluting reign spans the entire globe, and it is only getting worse.
We can remain in subjugation as the world deteriorates around us, or we can take action against the institutions which control our lives and planet. The decision is ours, individually and collectively.
And we see no other path but to resist.
As Dwight David Eisenhower said, the problem in defense is how far you can go without destroying from within what you were trying to defend from without.
So, is this national defense? The military-industrial complex acts with impunity.
It violates international treaty and law.
It consumes the majority of oil and petroleum.
It pollutes physical, cultural, and political environments.
It leaves a toxic legacy for endless generations.
Drives global warming and climate change.
Determines, pushes, and profits from U.S. war policy.
Supports and exports capitalism. It's a voracious and polluting economic force. Militarism defiles the sacred earth, the air. This is Hiroshima. We know that story, that sad story.
90 to 140,000 people instantly incinerated.
It defiles the rivers and springs.
Like this beautiful Nola Chucky. Up there, nuclear fuel services in urban Tennessee manufactures fuel for the U.S. Navy's fleet of nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers. It downblends highly enriched uranium to a low-enriched form to fuel TVA nuclear reactors. This plant has a history of serious safety problems.
This Nola Chucky River drains the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. It provides the drinking water for many Tennessee communities. There are no known other sources of uranium in the area other than nuclear fuel services.
According to reports of water soil testing over a three-county area downstream from this plant across a three-county area, I think I said that. Most of these samples demonstrate unequivocally and beyond any reasonable doubt that there's a highly enriched uranium as well as depleted uranium present in the environment. Another example of impacts to rivers would be proposed uranium mining in and around Danville, Virginia, near the Roanoke River, which provides drinking water to more than 1 million people in Virginia and Norfolk and other communities. The Geological Survey shows as much as 110 million pounds of uranium ore in the area, worth perhaps $10 billion. town.
Militarism pollutes the oceans and the seas. World War II, over 9,000 military, auxiliary, and merchant marine vessels were sunk. There is no mitigation plan in place or risk analysis. Threats include unexploded ordnance, leaking oil, hazardous materials, and chemical weapons that, of course, cause degradation of the marine habitat and our coastlines.
Ever since World War II, there are 8 reported nuclear submarines that have sunk due to fires, explosions, flooding, or other disasters, and any removal efforts would be costly and damn near impossible. Their nuclear reactors litter the ocean floor.
During and after World War II, chemical weapons were dumped at sea. Millions of pounds of mustard gas and nerve agents.
Are there.
Even the very heavens were polluted. The U.S. Air Force tracks more than 18,000 objects in orbit. Boats, broken satellites, fuel tanks, rocket motors, and other junk.
Debris from February 2009 collision of an Iranian communications satellite with a Russian satellite, added even more space debris. It's happening everywhere.
And now we've got the proposed Mars Science Lab mission that's going to use, if they get away with it, 10.6 pounds of plutonium-238 as a heat source while it probes the cold planet. A plutonium-238 is about 270 times more radioactive than plutonium-239. Consider an accident there.
So is this national defense or full spectrum dominance? Full spectrum dominance can be defined as a military concept whereby a joint military structure achieves control over all elements of the battlefield, battle space using land, air, maritime, and space-based assets. Full spectrum dominance requires full spectrum resistance, and the military-industrial contact touches us all. So work against it wherever you are. That's nutrient. We'll come back to that. Honestly, if you'll ask that again, please.
Our friend Bruce Gagnon, who's presenting here and not to miss his workshop, has told us the South is vital to this plan for the weaponization and nuclearization of space. This is the Alabama Redstone Arsenal.
And it's home to the U.S. Army Missile Command, the Army Ordnance Missile and Munitions Center, and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center.
It's the nerve center for the Army's missile and rocket programs. And in the early 40s, over 550 families were forcibly displaced when the Army took it over.
For the Redstone facility. And what was that for, in some ways? In 1948, the Operation Paperclip brought SS officer Werner von Braun and more than 700 other Nazi scientists to the U.S. to exploit Germany's expertise with supersonic rockets, nerve gas, jet aircraft, guided missiles, stealth technology, and hardened armor. And von Braun was soon installed at the Redstone Arsenal in a top position.
In 1955, these ardent Nazis had been granted citizenship, given prominent positions in the scientific community here. Many had been longtime members of the Nazi Party and the Gestapo, had conducted experiments on humans in concentration camps, used slave labor, and committed other war crimes. Their Nazi philosophy is now deeply embedded within the MI6.
So we also ended up being contaminated not only by their Nazi ideology, but we were contaminated by their rocket science. Perchlorate is a rocket fuel that contaminates groundwater and drinking water in 36 states. More than 4% of the public drinking water systems are contaminated with perchlorate. The most common and most significant perchlorate contamination is from manufacture, testing, and disposal of solid rocket fuel explosives fireworks. Perchlorate disrupts the thyroid's production of hormones critical to developing fetuses and infants. 5 to 7 million people may be drinking water contaminated with perchlorate.
This is how we take care of our own. As the Marine slogan says, for 30 years, Marines and their families drank and bathed in contaminated water, contaminated with solvents from a nearby off-base dry cleaning company, from on-base use of chemicals to clean their military equipment, and between 400,000 and 1.1 million gallons of fuel leaked from underground fuel storage tanks.
The main family housing units polluting military family water wells for decades, with as many as 70 identified toxins at concentrations of between 240 to 3,400 times permitted by state safety standards. It's unclear the full extent of the contamination. There's a long history of lost documents, poor management, deceptive lab tests, and out-and-out lack of cooperation with authorities.
Bases, we all fall down.
So with 900 to 1,000 U.S. military installations around the globe, in almost every country, major bases such as Fort Benning, Georgia, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, are city sites with all the pollution associated with urbanized areas, as well as the negative psychosocial impacts on the mental and physical well-being of the base personnel and surrounding populations. 29
million Americans, that's 1 in every 10, live within 10 miles of a toxic military site. Do you know where yours is? Already labeled these sites under the Superfund program as a top priority, but there are many, many more that haven't yet been certified. The military maintains there must be national sacrifice zones where weapons and soldiers can be tested for war.
Another example outside our national borders would be in the Philippines, where Clark Airfield and Subic Naval Station were abandoned. And after Mount Pinatubo erupted, as many as 20,000 homeless Philippine people were moved onto the base to resettle. They dug their wells, they planted their crops. And almost immediately, the Philippine health officials noticed a sudden rise in stillbirths, spontaneous abortions, birth defects, kidney, skin, nervous system disorders, and increased cancers. They learned later of the heavy metals, the acids, the solvents, and munitions buried all over the site. And the Philippines' request for U.S. help in solving this problem was met soundly with, "Our laws don't allow us to respond to your request."
Now we get to military oil consumption.
With 1.4 million active duty military, that's less than 1/4 of 1% of the U.S. population. Per capita military use of oil at 1 million barrels per day is about 10 times that of civilian use. In 1 year, the average civilian driver produces about 10,000 pounds of greenhouse gases, mainly carbon, with our stop-and-go type driving. Our military pollution is equal to about 14.6 million cars being driven the entire year, 24/7.
Military data at best, of course, is an informed estimate. Ships and tanks use bunker fuel 1,000 times dirtier than diesel, producing both
sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide,
leaving a thicker layer of gases in the atmosphere and holding in more heat.
Aviation fuel, on the other hand, impacts the environment about 2.7 times greater than standard fuel because of the extra NO2, SO2, soot, and water vapor it produces. The water vapor crystallizes in the upper atmosphere, creating an insulating barrier that keeps in more heat. This is actually a more effective heat cap than greenhouse gases. JP8 fuel is a high-powered, highly toxic jet fuel and is used more and more. It's heavier and evaporates slowly. Its chronic exposure impacts liver functions, causes emotional dysfunction, abnormal brain function, shorter attention span, lower sensory motor speed, compromises immune systems, and increases cancer. For its personnel handling JP8 fuel, the Department of Defense allows them to wear rubber gloves.
Now we have in Alabama the old World War II base, the Anniston Army Depot. In the 1940s, you see toxins. To the 70s, toxins were disposed of in trenches, lagoons, landfills, or other holding vessels. In 1997, that much later, the U.S. finally signed the Chemical Weapons Convention Treaty, and for the begin destruction of these weapons stockpiled by us, and that's still underway. At Anniston, as many as 2,254 tons of chemical munitions were stored in these dirt-covered concrete bunkers. When the military decided to do the incineration after 1997, they wanted to do it on site of deadly nerve agents without any public representation, thus violating the National Environmental Protection Act.
And the Anniston incinerator was the first to be located in a populous area. About 75,000 people lived in and around that facility. Because even a small accident could be catastrophic. 35,000 people were issued gas masks and kits of duct tape and plastic sheets.
By 2011, nearly 90% of all of the chemical weapons stored in Anniston since the 50s had been burned in their $855 million incinerator. Now they're looking to how to keep that incinerator busy, so folks around Anniston are a bit nervous. Then we moved to Pine Bluff,
And
so-called America's arsenal.
Pine Bluff Arsenal has released 721,364 pounds of chemicals into the air, water, and land, and was listed as a DoD, report in a DoD report as a top polluter. You have to remember that this data from military is really deep, so therefore the informed estimate. In 2010, they completed the disposal of 12% of the U.S. chemical weapons stockpile, but the arsenal recycled 6.5 million pounds of contaminated steel chemical weapons tanks as part of the Army's commitment to protect the environment.
They rinsed them off. In West Tennessee, I'm a Tennessean, so I'm learning a lot about the full length and breadth of my very, very toxic state. We have American Ordnance Systems, Inc. That's the Milan Army Ammunition Plant. It's a World War II relic, too, on 22,540 acres. We drove by there recently. Very, very impoverished area. Wastewater discharges from previous operations there have contaminated soil, sediment, and groundwater with their explosive compounds. Plumes of contaminated groundwater migrated into the Memphis sand aquifer that supplies drinking water to the 9,000 people of the city of Milan, Tennessee. In an effort to reduce costs recently, the Pentagon wants to change Milan's mission. Hundreds of the local jobs will be lost, and they're very concerned about that. Because what will come in their place, it will become a storage for our nation's weaponized uranium and a disassembly plant for uranium weapons that are no longer functioning as horrifically as they would like them to. In East Tennessee, again, we have the ammunition plant, another World War II relic. It's producing explosives and propellants for the Trident nuclear submarines. I passed there on the way to my sister up in East Tennessee. Dismal place. Explosives there require the use of concentrated nitric acid and anhydrous ammonia. These toxins are all around there, and this was part of the Manhattan Project in 1942. We know the Manhattan Project brought us the lethal advance of the atomic age.
So radioactive fallout from atmospheric nuclear tests caused 86,000 birth deaths and 150,000 premature deaths, we suspect. From 1945 to 1992, 1,054 U.S. nuclear tests were reported. Most were detonated at the Nevada test site, with more than 60 nuclear weapons dropped on the people of the Marshall Islands. Others were detonated in Alaska, Colorado, Mississippi, and New Mexico, underground. From 1945 to 1975, the U.S. government's human radiation experiments exposed as many as 16,000 civilians, U.S. hospital patients, prisoners, disabled children, and pregnant women to high doses of radiation without their knowing consent.
I didn't know about Mississippi. All right, those tests. We had plenty of those tests. Atmospheric tests. 210,000 U.S. soldiers were exposed. You see them here sitting there very dullly watching the explosion there. The National Cancer Institute admitted in 1997 that fallout from the 1950s atomic bomb test blanketed the nation at levels far in excess of what the government has admitted. Surprise! It said there could be between 10,000 and 75,000 cases of thyroid cancer among those exposed.
And that's linked to Atomic Secret City. The uranium-fueled atomic bomb that devastated Hiroshima was powered by the output of Y-12 and K-25 facilities there at Oak Creek. The plutonium-fueled bomb that was dropped in Nagasaki was fueled by a hand from Washington's plutonium. And the Y-12 National Security Complex is the nation's primary storehouse of weapons-grade plutonium and the key producer of uranium parts used in every nuclear weapon in the U.S. arsenal. Oak Ridge is part of the National thermonuclear assembly line, which includes the Los Alamos National Labs in Mexico and a facility in Kansas City, which manufactures all of the non-nuclear components of our thermonuclear weapon.
And as if we don't have enough, in 2011,
in 2011, Obama approved an additional $7.5 billion for a uranium processing facility able to produce 80 thermonuclear secondaries every year, assuring a stockpile of death for generations to come.
Right now, we have friends who are facing sentencing this week, up to months and months of time in prison and jails for standing up and saying no to this abomination. After Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize after negotiating nuclear arms reduction understanding with the Russian president, then he does this. The secondary, which we're talking about being produced here, forms the hydrogen part of a thermonuclear bomb.
The secondaries contain plutonium and uranium and lithium salt supplies and hydrogen fuel. The U.S. has 1,500 nuclear weapons on territorial alert, and the U.S. submarine-launched and land-based long-range missiles are now undergoing what we call life extension programs. This will extend the effective life of these weapons for 100 years. Building the Y-12 uranium processing facility will disrupt or destroy 8 wetlands.
Oak Ridge is indeed, and has been since they displaced so many people, a toxic Tennessee town. There are 711 contaminated, 711 contaminated sites identified, 247 buildings, 56 waste burial grounds. It's a toxic tapestry of some of the worst, longest-lasting poisons known, and has the highest risk profile of any DOE cleanup site. The bomb plant used tons of mercury and lithium enrichment. Huge quantities of this metal pollute the soil, groundwater, the creeks, the Clinch River, and downstream reservoirs.
Mercury poisoning causes disabilities from leukemia to attention deficit disorder, we believe. The number of kids with mental retardation increased at a rate 4 times that of the state during that period. Learning disabilities in school-age children more than doubled from 1990 to 1996, and the number of kids with health-related disabilities jumped from 8 to 123 in that same period.
Y'all need to take a breath.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Nuclear industry workers also irradiated, and U.S. sailors and soldiers used as lab rats.
Over 300,000 people, or half of those who ever worked in the U.S. nuclear weapons complex, have been affected by exposure to radiation. And during the 1960s and early 70s, the Department of Defense conducted 46 tests, known under the moniker Project 112 and Project SHAD, using nerve agents, chemical and biological agents on uninformed and unwilling military personnel. See the pattern? These tests, such as Autumn Gold, Copperhead, Project SHAD, and other unnamed tests, were aboard U.S. Navy vessels that may have in effect murdered hundreds, perhaps thousands of active duty U.S. military personnel and then lied to them and refused them treatment for over 40 years.
Then we have accidents falling out of our skies, 32 so-called broken arrows between 1950 and 2000, nuclear weapons accidents.
March 10th of 56, it was a B-47 carrying 2 nuclear capsules on a non-stop flight from MacDill Air Force Base near Tampa to an overseas base, and it failed to make contact for mid-air refueling over the Mediterranean for second refueling. No trace was ever found of the plane or the nuclear cargo. In 58, 2 years later, a B-47 collided with an F-86 in a simulated combat mission off the Georgia coast near Savannah. A nuclear weapon on board was jettisoned over the water, and the plane later landed safely, but the nuclear weapon was never recovered. In North Carolina, near the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base near Goldsboro, while on the airport alert, a B-52 suffered a mid-air refueling accident and was resulting in the parachute release of 2 thermonuclear weapons. One landed safely, the other one broke apart and crashed into a swamp and buried deep into it. The officials assessed the possibility of a detonation and abandoned the recovery effort, purchased the area, and put a fence around it. It's worth noting that the one that they did recover had as many as tripped. That's why they abandoned the search.
Here we are in Mississippi. It's new to me to find out that there was an atomic detonation in Mississippi, not far from where I was growing up. The U.S. government officials, right here, on October 22nd of 1964, so-called Project Salmon, the DOE and Atomic Energy Commission detonated a 5.3 kiloton nuclear device underground in South Mississippi near Hattiesburg, ostensibly to study seismic wave propagation in the southeast. Most of the radioactive material at the Tatum Salt Dome nuclear test site, which is what they call it, was put back into the test cavity where it remains today in solid or sludge form. Some of the radioactive liquids were injected into a vein of salty water located about 2,500 feet underground. 400 residents were evacuated from the area, mostly poor, of course, people of color, were paid $10 per adult, $5 per child for their inconvenience. The zone from which citizens were evacuated stretched 5 miles downwind of ground zero. 2 years later, something they called the Sterling event, a 380-ton nuclear device was detonated. These were the only nuclear explosions on U.S. soil east of the Rocky Mountain states.
So you see in this picture, this headstone-like thing, it's got a brass plaque on it. The government erected that. Basically, it says, "Don't dig here." Well, you know, I got it right warning us about the military-industrial complex, but his program to move atomic weapons to like nuclear power, he just didn't get it. So here we have the evil twins, nuclear weapons and nuclear power. They're the only, most of the potential energy from a nuclear power plant actually has been absorbed in its construction. Most of the remaining power is lost to inefficiency in long-distance transmission and in use. All that's really produced in a nuclear power plant is lots of radioactive waste, lots of money for very few people, and weapons-grade plutonium. A typical 1,000 megawatt reactor produces enough plutonium each year for 40 nuclear bombs. The uranium enrichment process is a technology that is needed both for nuclear power and nuclear weapons. The reprocessing of irradiated nuclear fuel results in large inventories of plutonium, which feeds nuclear weapons proliferations and lots more radioactive waste. And as Al Gore said, during my 8 years in the White House, every nuclear weapons issue that we dealt with was connected to a nuclear reactor program.
The USA has over 70,000 tons of nuclear waste, and it's deadly for tens of thousands of years, and there's no place to put it.
We have 140 USA nuclear reactors that add approximately 2,000 tons each year of high-level radioactive waste.
We are wasting the future. 95% of high-level radioactive waste comes from the irradiated fuel in the core of nuclear power reactors.
Each 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant produces about 500 pounds of plutonium a year. There's about 30 metric tons of high-grade, high-level radioactive waste.
All 6 of the nation's licensed nuclear waste dumps have or are leaking. Is the South the sacrifice zone? We think so. We know so. Environmental risks were offered as unavoidable trade-offs for jobs and a broadened tax base in economically depressed communities, according to the book Dumping in Dixie by the scholar Dr. Robert Bullard.
So Mississippi, Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama, as you may already know, are cheap labor, right-to-work states. These are the economies that were defeated during the Civil War, devastated during the Civil War. They came back only after the United States began mobilizing for World War II. And as is represented in Dr. Bullard's statement here, the environmental racism is alive and well in the South.
In South Carolina, we have the Barnwell radioactive waste dump. For 35 years or more, Barnwell was the only low-level radioactive waste dump east of the Rockies. Rad waste is stored there in steel drums encased in concrete vaults and buried.
So again, you have to understand that low level is a misleading and inaccurate statement. It may only be slightly less powerful as fuel, and inaccurate labeling happens regularly and causes a lot of problems, particularly with the workers.
So we've got a lot of rad waste. Gonna move it? Well, where? Yucca
In the late 80s, the Yucca Mountain Robotics site was determined to be the permanent repository for this. They took that off the table for engineering, geological reasons. But after the proposed waste burial at Yucca Mountain was canceled, attention was turned again to these beautiful Appalachian Mountains, which are 2 miles of continental granite base. If they decide to move all this waste, it would take about 9,600 rail and about 1,100 heavy haul highway shipments to move the first 70,000 tons of nuclear waste over the next 20 years down to the Savannah River site for reprocessing to retrieve the weapons-grade plutonium, bringing 240,000 times the measurable radioactivity that's already been buried at Barnwell into the state. And if it's reprocessed in South Carolina, the nearest likely location for a permanent repository for highly radioactive waste is in western North Carolina. It's about 20 minutes outside of Asheville.
We don't want it, you don't want it. Let's not make any more. North Carolina and Asheville is at the nuclear crossroads.
And you can see on there, there's 3 fatal flaws in its transportation strategy: inadequate emergency response, risk of terrorism, sabotage, radiation exposure from routine shipments, all of which endanger public health and safety. The new measure of radioactivity is 1 truckload coming by you is the equivalent of 4 barn wells, and 1 rail car that you might see is the equivalent of 16 barn wells. So the South Carolina Savannah River site, which is where they would take this waste for reprocessing, is thought to be the most contaminated in the world site in the world. And since the 310 square mile Savannah River site began operation in 1951 to manufacture tritium and weapons-grade plutonium to support our weapons program, the Savannah River site has generated over 140 million gallons of liquid radioactive waste. The South Carolina counties around SRS have the highest cancer mortality rate in the state due to exposure to ionizing radiation. Savannah River site has dumped 104 million gallons of this liquid waste into the air with its evaporation processes. The current mission involves waste management, vitrification, and other ideas. It's currently geared up to reprocess waste with plutonium. The name has changed recently over the past 2 administrations from the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership to the U.S. Energy Center, the U.S. Energy Freedom Center. As you can see, you can't see on the map, but they have about 1% of some green energy that they call reprocessing, recycling, so these must be green jobs.
As a TVA whistleblower, Ann Harris said, atoms for peace and atoms for war have a marriage made in hell. Here we have the TV Watts Bar nuclear reactor in Tennessee. They're also a tritium production plant now. Tritium is a radioactive isotope of hydrogen. Producing this in a nuclear power plant violates international non-proliferation treaties. But tritium is essential for maintaining the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile. It boosts the explosive power of nuclear weapons. And tritium produced at Watts Bar in Tennessee is shipped in casks for separation at the tritium extraction facility in Savannah Riverside, moving right along on our roads and highways.
So now you get to Mississippi.
Mississippi, again, we have the Grand Gulf Nuclear Station. You remember the recent catastrophic flood? Well, it got all up in that plant, and after the floods, plant workers discovered they were pumping water containing this radioactive tritium for days before they realized it would shut off the pipes. Figured it would be diluted in our great, fine, deep, and verdant Mississippi.
Tritium can cross the placenta and posing a risk of birth defects in early pregnancy.
We got 5 minutes going. Radiation is all over the southeast, and we're dumping and burning in Tennessee, where 75% of U.S. low-level radioactive waste, 41 million pounds per year, comes to our town in Tennessee. And coming soon, 1,000 tons of German radioactive waste. And Energy Solutions Inc. is applied to report another 20,000 tons from Italy. We like how make it right. They were all poisoned with, as she says, the way they treated people of color throughout the U.S. is the way they are treating countries of color throughout the world. Doris, estimates range from 187 to 289 different compounds, including arsenic, cadmium, I can't pronounce all that junk, but I'm telling you, it was killing them. And her grandmother died from cancer, all of her family members, and she's madder than hell and standing up. And Stud McMemphis, now they do this to the African American people there. They routinely assign the most hazardous work, cutting apart damaged and highly radioactive reactors, and they manipulate the dosimeters to mask the actual exposure.
We're back to like the nuclear fuel services and urban supplies the fuel for the Trident submarine, converts weapons, great for uranium.
We're going to make it. Georgia tried a nuclear submarine. I'm telling you, that's a bad thing too, and it's going on right in Georgia.
It's applied, NFS provides the fuels for this.
If you want to go to Florida, your baby teeth might get their teeth kind of, their Turkey Point nuclear reactor and the St. Lucie nuclear reactor. The strontium in baby teeth is increasing.
Strontium-90 has an affinity with calcium in the body, and that's where's the positive.
Y'all all know about the shake, rattle, and roll on the North and a nuclear generating station just near here. And those massive concrete containers holding your high level waste just moved along on the road there.
Here's a quick peek.
There's a lot of earthquake zones where
Those are all reactors.
power places are. We know about weaponized uranium. Do we know what it does to the children of Iraq, to the children of Gulf War veterans, to the veterans themselves, with hundreds of tons of exploded uranium creating genetic damage for generations? This is a war crime of tremendous. It's produced these weapons, many of them, in Jonesboro, Tennessee, the story capital of the world, storytelling capital of the world. There are people, including Christian peacemaker teams, who are working on that. We got maybe 1 minute, God. We got a lot to tell y'all, but we're going to be around for questions later. The U.S. has sold DU weapons to 29 countries. All right.
So another form of pollution is spiritual and religious values, and a man's coming up.
All right. Civil liberties are lost. Here are our parting words. I do not ask that you put bans upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight. It's all in our hands, folks. It's all in our hands.